Afrika Afeni Mills is an education consultant, adjunct instructor, and the author of Open Windows, Open Minds, Developing Anti-Racist, Pro-Human Students. She works with teachers, instructional coaches, and administrators to develop and sustain student-centered learning experiences that are diverse, inclusive, and equitable. Afrika has been featured on podcasts, blogs, delivered keynote addresses, and facilitated sessions at conferences across the United States. Afrika believes that all educators can be motivated, engaged, dynamic practitioners and leaders when provided with the support needed to create student-centered, anti-bias, anti-racist, culturally responsive learning environments that inspire wonder and creativity and nurture diversity, belonging, equity, and inclusion. And now I will turn it over to Afrika.
Thank you so much, Margaret, and welcome everyone. I've been really looking forward to this evening for a while, and I want to say a couple of words of welcome to you. Before we get started, I am so aware of several things. One, we're getting to that point in the semester or the part of the school year where we're looking forward to a break. And so I know that's usually true during this time of the school year. And I think even more so now and I don't even know which word to quite use. I want to say post-pandemic. I don't know what stage this is. Like, I talked to some friends and we were like, endemic, what are we in now officially? I don't even know. But just having said all that, like, you're coming together with me and sharing space with me during this season of the year, in this, the world that can feel so heavy right now. And at the end of your workday, if you were in school today or working today. So first of all, thank you so much for sharing space with me. And I'm just going to jump us right in and get us started, because the first place I'd like to start is talking a bit about my why. And so if any of you are also fans of Jacqueline Woodson's work, you'll recognize the picture on the top left as being from her amazing book, The Other Side. And you'll recognize that is Annie and Clover, the characters from The Other Side, who are a young Black girl and young white girl who want to play together, but their town is segregated. And so, as children do, before they get interrupted by us adults who end up putting our stuff on them, they just want to play together. And so they figure out a way to spend time together. So they figure out that even though their adults in their lives have told them that they cannot cross the fence, no one ever told them that they couldn't sit on the fence. And so they end up sitting there to play with one another. And then that connects me to this picture that I've seen on the internet. I don't remember when's the first time I saw it, and I don't know who to attribute it to, so I apologize. But it's an image that I have seen pretty regularly. And what I love about it is that when we look at children, their natural state is to be together and to be uninterrupted in their play. And sometimes they go through different things with one another, but typically it's, things that children may typically argue about what's fair or who gets to go first, things like that, but typically not across racial lines until later on. And so this is my why behind why I wrote Open Windows, Open Minds, because I'm like, yeah, race is a social construct that was created to separate us. And since it was done, it's something that can be undone. And so my why for writing the book, for doing the work that I do, is because I want to contribute to dismantling that interruption that can happen between us. So a little about me. I am originally from Brooklyn, New York. A lot of people are like, yeah, we can tell. I have not lived in Brooklyn since I was 19, and I don't mind sharing my age. I am 48 years old now. My husband and I raised our family in and around Boston, Massachusetts, but typically folks tell me that they can't tell that by what they say is my New York accent, which just feels like Afrika talking to me. So I ended up going to get my graduate degree in elementary teaching at Boston College, and taught fourth and fifth grade, and then ended up being bitten really hard by the professional development bug. I love supporting teachers because I believe that in order to have the classrooms that we say that children deserve, we have to we have to make sure that we're supporting those who are providing the direct support and teaching for students. And I love professional learning and making sure that it is something that is supportive and responsive and engaging. And most of my work has focused on culturally responsive and sustaining educational practices, and then also on anti-bias, anti-racist educational practices as well. So let's jump more into the content. I think in a lot of ways, because like I mentioned too, race being a social construct, I think about the work that came from the Human Genome Project, which basically proves that we are 99.9% genetically the same as a human family, and that even the diversity that exists within us, it's really within ethnic groups and not across ethnic or racial lines. And so what I believe helps to create wholeness when we think about being practitioners and when we think about the type of instructors we want to be with students, the type of learning experiences and environments that we would like to provide for students, we need to be whole ourselves. And so the way that, if you had a chance to read Open Windows, Open Minds, or if you haven't yet, the way that the book is constructed is so that the first part of the book gives an opportunity for us to engage, particularly those of us who are white identifying teachers who are working in environments with mostly or completely white students in our student body. And so just really thinking about the fact that has been, segregated schools are something that have existed for a long time, and we've never quite gotten a handle on it. And so since that's true, that means that those of us who are educators did not learn in a way that was culturally responsive or anti-racist, anti-bias, or really basically pro-human, which really invites and involves the backgrounds and identities of all people into our learning spaces. If we didn't have that ourselves, then that means that it's something that we are ill prepared to offer to our students. And so my desire, my hope for us is that we're able to do a bit of our own healing. And so that's how the first part of the book is constructed. And then we will be then prepared to offer students something more whole. And so, so that's my why and my posture, the posture with which I approach this work. One of the things that I've been thinking about, whether it be as I was writing the book or as I do the work, whether it be, working, in conference sessions or in PLCs that I'm working with teachers around the country or book discussion groups, that a lot of times what ends up happening is that we have a really hard time having conversations about race. They're usually very loaded, especially nowadays. Nowadays, it's even more loaded than I feel like it used to be. And I think maybe it's because we're starting to talk about it a bit more, and then we're seeing a bit of a response to that, a negative response. And a lot of times what ends up happening is that when we talk about race, we don't always talk from the perspective of racialization. And that's the approach that I take, because when we start with words like racism, that usually puts folks in a position of thinking about who they are personally, right? So if I am someone who is in a dominant racial group, and I'm going to use the word racial because that's what we use, even though we know race is a social construct. If I'm part of a dominant racial group and someone is like, oh, you did something racist, or that's a racist view, or something like that, it can cause defensiveness, because it's like, if I'm thinking on an individual level, I've determined to not be someone who is racist. I am not someone who, a lot of times when people will say, like, I'm not a part of the Klan, I'm not a neo-Nazi, my family did not own enslaved people, right? And so I wanted to really put up this graphic because I think that that's where a lot of our struggle may be. So the four eyes of oppression are depicted here, being individual, interpersonal, institutional, and also what structural, it says structural here, but we think about what could be the ideological parts of the way we think about race. And so a lot of times what ends up happening is that we think about what impact we have or want to have on an individual or interpersonal level. And, the person's personal beliefs and actions are important, as are the way that we interact with one another. And at the same time, I can be a good person and be part of a dominant group, and still, because I may not see the impact of the institutional and structural and the ideological parts of oppression, those systems may be uninterrupted. And so racialized or racist systems will persist. And so that's the thing I want to talk with us about today, is that we're thinking about building our own individual and interpersonal skills, but knowing that that's not the whole part of the work that we have to do. We really want to build that foundation as a means toward really interrupting systemic oppression and institutional injustice. And so keep that in mind too, that individual and interpersonal matters. Absolutely, who you determine to be as a person, and also there are institutional systems that we want to interrupt. And so I want to talk a little bit about myself, because it's also important to me in this work that that you know about me, that I'm not someone who's just like, yes, I am on the mountaintop and I am aware and, I am woke and I really understand all these things and I'm trying to give this knowledge to you. That's not how I see myself. I see myself as someone who is a learner. I definitely understand where the word woke came from, and then it turned into something else. And so I usually will say that I don't think of myself as someone who is woke. I think woke is, in the way that it's become known and been defined a lot more lately, is because I believe that Martin Luther King Jr. was the first person to make use of the term. But now it seems like in some cases, people will use it as a badge of like, oh, I'm better than someone else. And I don't really think that that's a good way to go when it comes to this work in particular. And so I want to talk about, to me, I think of myself in terms of awakening. So I want to share examples of how I have awakened in different ways. And so this picture is my darling son, Cairo. So that's him on the top left. That's him when I think he's 5 in that picture. And then underneath that picture, you can see this is me and Cairo at his high school graduation. He is now a sophomore, finished up his first semester of his sophomore year at Boston College. So he is getting his bachelor's degree in the same school where I got my master's degree from, which I feel really proud of that. And I'm actually doing some teaching at Boston College as well. I'm in North Carolina, so I get to do that virtually. But anyway, this is my baby. He just turned 20, and his older sister, Serena, has just turned 21. So I have back-to-back babies. But where I think about this work in particular is being the mom of Cairo, who is left-handed. And so not to my knowledge, that I have anyone in my family who was left-handed. And my husband's mom was left-handed, but she grew up in a generation where they thought of it as something wrong, in some ways evil. And so they would force her to use her right hand because they thought that something was wrong with being left-handed. And so she, I think, ended up being ambidextrous, but was supposed to have been someone who was left-handed. And so when I realized that Cairo was left-handed, I was intrigued. I was like, oh, this is pretty cool. This is different, right? And so, but just because I'm his mom and because I knew him didn't mean that I understood his needs as a left-handed person, because that was not my lived experience. And so I'm very much about being humble and vulnerable in my stories. So when he was younger, he and his sister, because they're just a year apart, whenever we'd get in the minivan, when they were going into their booster seats, they would always switch places. Like they wouldn't sit in any one booster seat because they were pretty much like generally the same size. And so sometimes when I was driving the car and Cairo was sitting behind me, he would say that he could not buckle himself in. When he was on the other side behind the passenger side, he would buckle himself in very easily. And for a long time, way too longer than I would care to admit, I don't even actually know how long I stressed this poor little boy out. But I thought that he was messing with me. I was like, why? Like, how come every other day you say you can't buckle yourself in? You did it successfully yesterday. I don't understand why this is a problem. And then eventually, I'm like, knowing that he was not, the type of kid who would just like aggravate me for no reason, I started to realize what was happening. I was like, okay, so when he's sitting behind me and he has to reach up with his right hand to buckle himself in, he's uncomfortable because his right hand is not his dominant hand. When he sits behind the passenger seat, when he gets to lift up to buckle himself in with his left hand, that is way more comfortable for him because that's his dominant hand. And so I say all that to say, and I'll show you on the next slide too, that there are so many ways that we, not because we're intentionally trying to cause harm or trying to do anything bad, right? Like we talked about interpersonally and individually being committed to being good people. So many of us came into education because we love children and we believe in the power and the right to education. But if we don't notice something, then we can do harm, not because we mean to, but because we don't we don't see what the impact is, right? And another example that I'll use is for myself as someone who is an able-bodied person. Have been way too many times where I have not been considerate of, or I didn't know to be considerate of what different needs may be when it comes to accessibility, even for my presentations and the way I design workshops. Even especially, I had been working through Zoom as a remote coach for probably about 5 years, maybe even 6 years before the pandemic hit. And so when we transitioned into doing way more things virtually, because my interactions with educators were mostly one-to-one, when I started to present more virtually, I didn't really realize what it meant to be to create an accessible space. So for example, I thought that, like if we just turned on the captions, that would be sufficient. And though that is something that is helpful, that doesn't mean that that's where we stop, or that I should only do things that I feel are accessible things without talking to people for whom that is their lived reality, right? So for someone who is deaf or hearing impaired, it would have been better for me to ask them, what is it that you need, as opposed to me assuming that I knew what they needed. So there's that part too. When I think about the many times, like I said, I'm not proud to admit this, but I'm being really honest with you, that there have been so many times that I've driven to a mall or to go to park somewhere, and I've seen multiple handicap accessible spaces available, or have seen an accessible bathroom stall available in a bathroom, where I've wanted to use those spaces myself, even though I don't need them, right? And so I just want to be honest about that. And then as someone who is cisgendered, I don't have to think about which bathroom I use most of the time. And then depending on how open a space is, there may be gender neutral bathrooms, or there may not be, but that's something I don't have to carry with me. So I just wanted to share that with you about myself, because we all have these spaces that we don't see fully, and we need to lean more into curiosity. I don't know if any of you are also Ted Lasso fans like I am, and I'm trying not to give a spoiler, but those of you who've watched it will know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't watched it yet, you will recognize it when you do, which I hope you do. But he talks a bit about the importance of curiosity. And so I just wanted to talk about that too, that a lot of times we don't see what we don't have as part of our lived reality, and we need to be more curious about things. So what I'm really leaning toward in the work that I do is, so I'm going to share some terms that I've been hearing most recently that really vibe with me, and I'm hoping that they vibe with you too, is that in doing this work around thinking about how do we create spaces and create a curiosity or an appetite for really being more inclusive in the content that we engage with as practitioners, but also for our students as well, that we really want to have a new social imagination and a new social consciousness, because what we were offered as students ourselves was I wanted to say it was an old way of thinking, but it didn't include all the richness that we bring to one another as human beings. And so I love these terms, and hopefully maybe they can help you too as you're thinking about why you're engaging in this work. And then the other thing I want to say too, which is it's not popular, but I think it's really important for us to recognize, is that a lot of times these conversations that we need to have about race and about injustice or oppression are difficult conversations, and we don't typically lean into discomfort, right? When we are thinking about what we want to engage in, we want it to be as comfortable as possible. Life is already pretty hard. So when we start thinking about engaging in something that's just going to be causing discomfort, it's not something that we naturally want to do. What I want to offer though is that until we are ready to lean into that discomfort, it makes it really challenging for us to progress into the world and society that we say that we want for ourselves and for our students. And so I want to talk about too the importance for creating spaces for processing grief and pain, because when we think about the things that have happened historically around the world, but particularly for our context in this country, they're not good. Some of the things that have happened are pretty awful, right? Some of the things that have happened require us to feel grief and require for us to really lean into some uncomfortable feelings. And because we typically look to avoid that, we really, when it comes time to have these conversations, a lot of times we are ill prepared. Whereas if we do approach from a sense of really like being curious, we're all going to find some things out that we may not have known before. And again, like leaning, like really talking about from my own perspective, because because I'm not set apart from any of you. I am part of the same, the same circumstance that I'm describing. When I was a kid, I think like many of you, the things that I learned about Indigenous folks, like, were so inaccurate, so inaccurate. I think, like many of you, most of what I don't even want to say I learned it. It just was like what I was exposed to was around Thanksgiving. There would be these, coloring pages or stories that we would hear about the first Thanksgiving, and it was very, very kind. It was the way that it was depicted was, it seemed like things were good. Then as I got older and not only started to really read about what has happened to Indigenous folks for so many years, for hundreds of years, I started to realize that I didn't know much at all. One of the main things is that a lot of times I was thinking of Indigenous people from a historical perspective as if they didn't exist anymore, even though there are currently more than 500 tribes of folks in the United States. There were so many things I didn't know. Like, I didn't know about the Trail of Tears. I didn't know about the Indian Removal Act. I didn't know about like the impact that the European arrival and settler colonialism had on Indigenous folks. And then as I started to meet more people who were Indigenous and hearing their stories, it started to have me question the things that I think about, even as a Black person in the United States. So as an example, one of the things that my parents would talk about and other Black folks would talk about is reparations for those of us who are descended from enslaved Africans. And a lot of times I would think about that too. Like, okay, well, we were supposed to receive 40 acres and a mule after, as part of Reconstruction, as what would happen post enslavement. And so I thought about those 40 acres and a mule quite a bit. Spike Lee is someone who named his film company 40 Acres and a Mule. And then as I got to know more Indigenous folks, I started to wonder, 40 of whose acres would we have been given had that happened? Where would that land have come from? What about the mule? Like, where would that have come from? And so those are things I didn't think about. So there's some grieving that comes with learning things that are uncomfortable and that are pretty awful. And that's okay, right? Because we are able to engage in grief and to process pain and to move beyond that into the joy that comes from connecting with one another. So in doing that, I do want to read, this is not the whole piece that Callista Bouchen wrote, and I think I'm saying her name correctly, I hope. There's some images that went along with the first part of something that she wrote, and you can look up the whole poem by Googling her name. But basically it says, I sit with my grief, I mother it, I hold its small, hot hand. I don't say shh. I don't say it's okay. I wait until it is done having feelings, and then we stand. So there's a little bit more to it if you want to check it out. But I think, yes, we need to give space for ourselves to feel. It is something that I think helps us to, like this thing, and moving on to the next slide, that helps us to be able to see things from one another's perspectives, that it gives us the opportunity to truly build empathy for one another, which is different than sympathy, right? And so when we think about being empathetic, we think about what it means to reflect back what we hear people saying, which means we need to be good listeners, active listeners. We want to seek to understand others' experiences. We want to listen attentively and withhold judgment. And we want to validate others' feelings and discover our similarities as well, right? And so those are things that I keep in my heart as I think about this work and as I support educators who are doing this work as well. And then a lot of ways too, I think about the children who are in our classrooms. Some of them are in the age that's depicted here in this artistic representation of children. But I love this picture because it's like, oh, the different shades of kids, right? And we have so many students that we work with from so many different beautiful backgrounds, and we don't need to suppress who they are. Being colorblind is not something that we need to pursue. And even though I understand, a lot of times people just tell people, don't say you're colorblind. I'm like, let's acknowledge that most of the time when people are saying that they're colorblind, basically what they're saying is that interpersonal individual piece, right? It's like, I have dedicated to not seeing the hue of someone's skin, their phenotype. I'm not looking at that as a deficit, right? hard stop, right? And I believe that that's what people's intentions are by saying that. But we don't need to be colorblind. We need to be able to see each other exactly for who we are. A lot of times people will use words like color smart or color brave. But just thinking about our kids and all they bring into our classrooms, we really want to create spaces and sustain spaces where they're able to connect with one another and learn from and with one another. And so I'll pause here to say a little bit more about the rationale behind the name of the book, the title of the book. I actually I have some support from folks who I interviewed for the book, but basically the framework of the book comes from began with Emily Stiles, and then the year after, Rudine Sims Bishop expanded on the concept of windows and mirrors. Rudine Sims Bishop took it a little bit further to include the sliding glass doors, and I actually had a chance. Ooh, sorry, hold on for a second. I don't know why that's doing that. Okay. So I had a chance to meet Rudine Sims Bishop's niece at a conference that I was at recently, but really thinking about the fact that we want students to be able to have the opportunity to see themselves reflected in our learning spaces. And so that's where we see mirrors, right? And so a mirror offers students the opportunity to see themselves reflected in the content, in the curriculum, in the stories that are told, in the ways of being and knowing. And then they also deserve the opportunity to gaze through windows to be able to discover things that are different from what they might identify with or relate to or have had in their personal experience. And what we notice a lot of times when we look honestly at our learning spaces is that we really have in a lot of ways, children of color have a lot of windows and far too few mirrors, especially nowadays when we think about how many people are, even though it's not the majority, which we'll get into in a second, how many people are engaging in trying to ban books that represent diverse perspectives and diverse characters and things like that. And so that happens in a lot of ways with children of color. And then when it comes to white students, a lot of times I want to offer a frame that's a bit like an extension of the windows and mirrors frame, is that it would be easy to say, looking at the content in the representation in children's books, that we really believe that white children get to see way too many mirrors and not enough windows into other people's experiences and identities and perspectives. But actually, when we think about the mirrors that white students even see, it's not even, and I'm borrowing this framework from my good friends Elizabeth Denevy and Jenna Chandler Ward of the Teaching While White blog and podcast, and the authors of Learning While White as well, where they're like, yeah, even the mirrors that white students get to see are blurry because you're seeing representation as if this is what is normal, right? And that, like, as if other people's contributions and histories and perspectives and experiences don't exist. And it doesn't often offer white students the possibility of seeing what it means to be a white person who works together in solidarity with people of color toward freedom and liberty for everyone, right? We don't often get to see, like, white students are not even often getting to see the representations of people like William Lloyd Garrison or the Grimke sisters or James Tyson, who Bettina Love talks about in her book, We Want to Do More Than Survive, who supported Bree Newsom's removal of the Confederate flag from the South Carolina State Capitol, or Jane Elliott, who taught her third grade Iowa, students in Iowa in 1968 about discrimination. We often don't see those examples. This even happened most recently. I have my nephew, my nephew is a Black man. His wife is a white woman who had a son who is also white before their relationship. And just really even thinking about my nephew and him even sharing a story saying that, as a young white man, he's 8 years old, and he was reading a book that I had given their family about where it stamped the young adult version, and he was hearing about white abolitionists and white freedom fighters, and he said that he was so happy to hear that there were white people who did good things. And she was asking me, are there books that he can read to know more about that? And I'm like, I really couldn't think of too many. I mean, there are a couple, but not anywhere near enough. So anyway, we're thinking about kids and what we want to offer them. They deserve something better. So did we. You see more about that in my book if you happen to read it. But just really continuing on with that, and I'm going to change the pronouns a bit in this quote from Nelson Mandela to be appropriately inclusive. But he said, "No one is born hating another person because of the color of their skin or their background or their religion. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love, for love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite." And I genuinely believe that. And sometimes folks, I'm like, I don't know. I'm very much like a huggy, loving type of person. So I don't mind talking about love and being involved in education because of love. But I think a lot of us really do that work from a place of love. And we have so much that we can do to influence our students and give them a different type of experience. And so one of the things I want to encourage you to do as you are engaging in this work is that I'm going to offer some specific frameworks in a bit, but one of the main things I want to encourage you to do is to find your marigolds. And so that concept I learned from one of the people I interviewed from the book, who had read the work of Jennifer Gonzalez from the Cult of Pedagogy, who had written an article really that was focusing on supporting new teachers. But I think the same concept is true for all of us, where marigolds are the type of flower that provide a protective quality. So if you're planting flowers or plants that you're trying to keep safe from bugs or from weeds, you can surround them with marigolds, and the marigolds will keep them safe and help them to be able to flourish and grow uninterrupted. And so what you're going to need to do, because this work is good work and it's also hard work, I encourage you to not do it by yourself, right? You want to do it together with other people. And so what I'm about to offer during the latter part of this webinar, I'm definitely going to allow some time for questions if you have them, is that we want to make sure that we are surrounding ourselves with a community of folks who are also engaging in this work so we can do it together. When we think about all of the efforts that have taken place, I mentioned abolitionists and civil rights workers, like folks did it together, they trained together, they were very intentional, and we need to do the same thing. And we need to offer one another accountability, yes, and also protection, because this work in a lot of ways can be scary, depending on, I know far too many friends who are involved in this work who have been targeted online and have had a lot of negative things come in their direction. So really, I encourage you to do this work together with other people, whether it be in your context or if you can establish community through groups who are also doing this work, which I'm happy to share. There are resources in the book that will share those possibilities as well. And so the other thing I want to talk about is so I talked about the first part of the book really engages in racial healing, racial consciousness development. We really start thinking about our identity development and what it is that we needed for ourselves so that we can offer something better to students. And then the latter part of the book, we have the chapters that focus on opening windows into overlooked contributions, histories, and experiences, where we get to really lean into content that may be unfamiliar to us, which depending on your context, which I really want to be real about that, and we'll talk about before the end of the webinar, is that it gets trickier depending on your state. Like if you're in a state that has active legislation against certain authors or certain books, then that's something you have to keep in mind. And also, I want to encourage you to really focus on the standards that you are addressing in your state and how you can make those connections to the content that you are engaging in with your students. So the book goes into a deeper dive with that. Another chapter focuses on opening windows into overlooked perspectives. And so there are ways of support in the book that really help you to support your students to engage in critical discourse with one another. And just really being clear about when I say critical discourse, I mean not debating whether or not someone deserves to be treated with human dignity. We're already going to go in with that assumption that we agree on that. That debate and discourse that I talk about in that chapter really has to do with what do we feel like are the best strategies for addressing injustice and for making things better? So not whether we will or not, because we all dedicating ourselves, right, as people who want to make the world better. We all agree that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. And so we can talk about what are the best ways to do that. And then there's another chapter where we open windows into overlooked challenges by engaging in action-oriented learning with students, which in some cases is called service learning or project-based learning, but it's really looking at not from a savior perspective of coming into a space and thinking that we have something to offer a community without their involvement, students and without partnering with them, but also in just thinking about like, how can we participate in making life for our human family as rich as possible for everyone. And so one of the things I want to offer, I have a friend of mine who was really she was part of the work that the Center for Anti-Racist Education created. They created this framework called the CARE framework, which if you look it up online, you'll be able to find amazing resources related to this framework. I wanted to offer this to you. It's something that focuses on these 5 principles, which begins with looking at our shared humanity, and then moves on to exploring historical truths with students, and then developing our critical consciousness, moving on to talking about race and racism. And then we build on all of the 4 preceding principles to really start to look at how we can influence just systems. I think that this framework can be really helpful because that humanity piece is so important, right? Like as a foundation. And a lot of times when we start to realize how things can get much better in the world, we want to jump right into creating just systems. And understandably, because the work it is urgent, but it's so urgent, please keep in mind that we want to do it with care and with intentionality. And so I wanted to offer this as a framework that we want to keep in mind as we're doing this work. And so that resource is something that you can get for free online. It has a self-assessment tool, so many supportive resources for discussion guides to really bring this into your context. And a lot of times having a framework from which you're doing this work is going to be really helpful. And so also to the work of Yolanda Seeley Ruiz, who talks a lot about racial literacy development that comes from, she's brilliant. Oh my gosh. I think I'm going to get to spend time with her soon, and I'm really excited about that. But yeah, she talks about the importance of these different pillars in this pyramid of interruption and the archaeology of self, which is what I really focus on in the first part of the book, and building our own historical literacy, engaging in critical reflection, really then building on that to bring forth critical humility, which is so important in this work. And then that leads to critical love. And so definitely want to encourage you, if you're not familiar with her work, she has an amazing TED Talk that you can watch and then just really engage with her work as well. And so like these concepts, like so many of them are so similar and bolster one another, but just want to offer those resources to you. And then think about the importance of navigating resistance, because we want to do the work, and we also need to be aware of not only the resistance that we will experience in society, but also what will come up in ourselves. Like I talked about that grief and that loss process, that can be really hard. And so we need to be honest about what we'll be facing when it comes to resistance, internal and external resistance in this work. And so first of all, what I want to bring to mind for us is that when it comes to learning things, typically we feel pretty excited and supportive of learning to do hard things. And so a lot of times when kids, if they have the opportunity and access, will learn how to play a sport or an instrument, will learn how to ride a bike. In riding a bike, right, you have to learn how to pedal and steer and balance and brake, and right, you have to bring all these things together. We also support students to learn new languages, right? And so those are all hard things that we really are pretty supportive of students learning how to do. When it comes to talking about race with students, though, it's almost as if we develop a type of amnesia about what it looks like to engage in doing hard things. And so a lot of the same type of principles we bring to learning hard things in general are the same principles that we can bring into the work that we do with students. But now in society, as I alluded to earlier on, there's a lot of resistance to that work with students. We have seen a lot of it is like in the media, we've seen a lot of folks who are, showing up at school board meetings and protesting what they're calling critical race theory, even though many of them don't really understand, one, what that is, and two, that it is a theory that is explored in higher education. But you notice things that are happening, right? There are proposed curriculum censorship bills. They increased 250% in 2022. And I think the last time I looked, which I think has changed, unfortunately, it has increased. is that there were only 6 states where there wasn't legislation passed banning books or proposing the banning of books or the not mentioning of gender identity and race and history in the United States. There were only 6 states where that had not been proposed or passed. And I think that that has changed even since then. And so, but I really want to encourage you though, because what's happening, I think that's the way media typically works, is that we usually hear what's coming from the loudest voices. And so what I want to encourage you though, is that most parents want classrooms to be places of learning and not political battlegrounds as they have started to become. And so this saying that I have here is a Mexican proverb that I really have come to learn. They tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds. And so I just want to just let you know and celebrate you. Like, I'm a seed, you're a seed, right? Like, even when you have a lot of stuff coming at you that feels like it's overwhelming, that there's so much life that's going to be able to come from what you know and what you're sharing with your students. So just want to encourage you that the way it's coming across in the media is not quite reality. And I have a couple of good friends who are involved in the Voices for Higher Education, and they wrote a report too that you can, and I'll give you my contact information so you'll be able to connect with me to get that link. But basically, it's a study that really talks about the fact that so many of us really want kids to learn in a way that is best for them. And what's happening with a lot of the noise that we hear of resistance to that is that's not the majority of us, but those of us who really support this work need to be a lot more intentional and a lot louder. And so I'm going to read this quote from, I have like a full page in the report. And so it says, when students can regard themselves in mirrors and discover what lies beyond the familiar through windows, they effectively make meaning of the world around them, their beauty, complexities, challenges, and possibilities. Book banning negatively impacts students' access to the resources needed to see themselves clearly and to recognize and value the histories, perspectives, and experiences of people who are unlike them, thereby severely damaging our ability to sustain a just democracy where we all actively contribute to the well-being of all people. And so I just wanted to call that out. That's one part of the report, but there's a lot more there to support you. So try to be encouraged, even though we hear a lot of noise to the contrary. And so want to definitely get into a space where you can ask some questions if you choose to. But these last couple of quotes I wanted to use to encourage you. One is, never trust your fears. They don't know your strength. And that's by Athena Singh. And then this next quote is also from me as a means of encouraging, right? Thinking about doing hard things. What's waiting for you on the other side when you allow yourself the gift of rising above what's challenging is an amazing view of all that's possible. And so just definitely wanted to say thank you so much for coming and sharing time with us this evening. And like I said, I'm not this evening, it's evening for me. But if you're in the evening, I'll just say late afternoon through evening, depending on where you are in the country. And so a couple of things before we go into questions and discussion is I have a newsletter that I send out once a month that I try to keep folks abreast of things regarding the book and other resources that are coming out, whether it be from other authors or learning opportunities that might be interesting to you. And so I just sent out my December 15th issue, but I will, like, if you sign up, you can use this QR code from the screen right now if you would like to sign up, or you can go to my website, which I'll give you the link to that as well. And if you sign up now, I'll go ahead and I'll forward you the one from December so you can have the most recent newsletter. But I'd love to keep in touch because part of this work is developing and sustaining community with one another. So please do sign up for the newsletter if you're interested. And the other thing I want to encourage you to do is that the book, like, there's the book itself, and then there's a companion website through Corwin where there are additional resources. And so you would be able to receive, like, based on each chapter, additional resources that you can just click on and look up. There are this guidance from a school librarian who I got to interview, annotated book lists and online resources, reflections from other anti-bias, anti-racist practitioners, student work samples, and the reflections of people on how they form their marigolds. And so definitely encourage you to go to the companion website. And then just finally, Mike, before we do questions and discussion, here you can take a screenshot of my information. The top is my website. You can find me on Facebook and on Instagram. I have a LinkedIn profile as well. And I'm Twitter, Lord, I can't even go into all that, right? But I'm still on Twitter presently. And so if you're on there, I'd love to connect with you there. And if you would like to email me, here is my email address as well. And so hopefully you have had a chance to take a screenshot of that. And so I want to move now into questions and discussion. So let me go ahead and open it up. And so didn't know if Margaret, if there were any questions that have come through from anyone that we might want to
There wasn't anything specific about your material. There were a couple of questions that Tori was able to answer as we were going along. Just links to your blog, and then also just the name of Yolanda Sealy.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Yes. So we answered that, and then one of our participants actually put the link to her TED Talk in the chat as well. Oh. But if there are any questions, we have a few minutes. If anyone has a specific question while we're still here, feel free to drop it in the chat. But Afrika, before we announce our book winners, if you just have any other...
Oh, I definitely have some other things I can share while we're waiting to see if people...
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit more about Yolanda Sealy Ruiz. So I have been hearing about her for a little while. Like, you're reading around different things and clicking on different links. And so I had an opportunity. So within the past, I think it was happening over the course of a month. There was a panel discussion that included, there was Paul Gorski, Cornelius Minor, who was one of the co-authors of the foreword for Open Windows, Open Minds, Cheryl Matias, and Yolanda Sealy Ruiz. They did a weekly, hour and a half discussion where they were talking about what it means to be an anti-racist teacher and what it means to reconstruct what it means to create learning environments. And I think that's important, one, before I continue talking about Yolanda's work. What's so really important about that is that a lot of times when we think about this work, we hear words that can feel somewhat alarming, like deconstruct, right? Sometimes it's just like, ooh, like we need schools, right? We need schools for children. And so if we're tearing things down, what is happening in the meantime? And what was really beautiful about the space that they created over the 4 weeks of their weekly discussion was that they were talking about what it means to both, yes, there are things that we need to get rid of. If they are harming children, if they are harming families and communities, they should not exist anymore. And also what we're wanting is to be able to, what Bettina talks about, right? Like Bettina Love talks about freedom dreaming. And so it's not to say that we're just like deconstructing schools. It's that we are getting rid of what is toxic in schools and what is harmful. And we are dreaming together about what it is that we want to create instead of that. And so that's one thing that I feel like she does an amazing job. Like how she builds in her work toward critical love is so great. And one of the examples that she uses was really very compelling for me, especially when I think about this work. So many people tend to still think that we shouldn't talk to young kids about race because they're not thinking about it. And it's not something that, it will take away their innocence if we start talking to them about race and racism. And, they're just really innocent and we don't want to interrupt that. And to a certain extent, I showed the picture in the beginning of kids just playing together. And yes, they really do connect with one another pretty naturally without, our shushing them and without our putting our own interrupted beliefs on them. But one of the things that you'll notice if you have, if you remember, if you've watched her TED Talk, and you will see if you do watch it, she talks about a story of a little girl. She's a little white girl. And she actually shows this clip in her TED Talk. The little girl is maybe 3 years old and she's talking to her mom, and her mom is like, the little girl is trying to say that, there's these cakes that are missing. And the mom is trying to ask the little girl, what happened to the cakes? They were here and now they're not. So the little girl was saying, she was like, it wasn't me, right? She said somebody broke into the house and they took the cakes. And her mom was like, really? Like the cakes only? They didn't take the computer. They didn't take the TV, no jewelry, nothing like that. They just came in and ate these cakes and then they left. And the little girl says, yes. And then you see her pause for a second. And then she says, and the man was a Black man. And I'm like, and it just like, talk about gut punch. It's like, she's so little. And you know that that's not something that she would have come up with on her own, right? I mean, she might have tried to throw blame, right? Like, be like, no, it wasn't me, right? Totally get that. But the fact that she articulated at such a young age that a Black man broke into her house and stole is something that was put into her mind. It could have been something that came from media, because it could have been something that comes from how things are addressed in the news, right? It could be from someone in her life. I don't know the little girl. And so I just wanted to say that, though, is that a lot of times we think that children don't notice things and that they don't pick up things. But those of us who know kids in our lives, we know they pick up on a lot. They pick up on a lot. They say things we prefer them not to say, because they say things that they may have been listening to from us that we didn't know they were listening to, right? But just wanted to encourage you that it's so powerful to really be a different voice in the life of a child, because they are listening. And that gives us great responsibility and a great opportunity. So I wanted to say a little bit more about Yolanda Sealy Ruiz's TED Talk.
Thank you. And then also, we did have one question come through that I think before closing would be kind of a powerful way to end. How do you protect your joy while doing such hard work?
How do I protect my joy? That's a very important question for me, because Joy, I am such a joy-centered person. Like on my wrist, I don't know if you can see it, but like on my wrist, my tattoo says joy. Like seriously, my mom, like my email address for my personal, it's like the first part is like joy spirit, because I'm such a joyful person. And so what I think, and I've been thinking about this honestly a lot lately, is that I don't believe that joy is something that you only have when things are going just right. I believe it's something that you hold on to because of the belief and the hope in things becoming better, but also not only that they become better, but that there are people that I'm getting to connect with, especially since the book has come out, who are so excited about engaging in this work. And even as I was writing the book, before I even published it, had the opportunity through, I don't know if you know if you're all familiar with the work of Debbie Irving. She wrote the book Waking Up White, and I highly recommend that book as well. It talks about her own journey of racial identity development and racial consciousness development. But anyway, she helped me get the word out to a bunch of teachers on her her newsletter subscribers. And there are like so many white folks who are around this country are doing this work, who volunteered to talk about them and their own journeys and their own mistakes and successes and the work that they're doing with students. And it's just amazing, amazing work. That's why I'm like so excited about people reading the online companion resources, because you don't see it in the media, like you don't see it on the news, and people are probably a little less ready to share it because of so much pushback in society. But there's so many of us doing this work around the country. And the more we get to connect with one another, the more encouraged I feel. And that's what really helps me to feel joyful, because I really do believe that there are more of us who are invested in doing our own work and in being different and doing our own healing so that we can offer something better to the world. I genuinely believe that. And so as I get to go out to conferences and get to meet people around the country who are encouraged by this work and who are willing to take the risk and try something, even when it's messy, I'm like, yes, that's what it's about, right? Like we know better and we do better, like Maya Angelou said. And that's what helps me to be joyful, because I see the possibility, I see the potential, I see that what's happening in actuality, because there's so many people who are pushing back and through difficult circumstances. And so I stay encouraged by that. And then also knowing, like, for me in my own journey, right, the things that I've come to learn from other people and get to know, like that has created such a capacious and expansive human experience for me. And the fact that I get to participate in that is such an honor. Like I genuinely am honored as I get to hear other people's stories and to really be alongside people as they are learning and growing and sharing. It's beautiful. It's so beautiful. And so that's what keeps me hopeful and joyful. Thank you for that question. Yeah, absolutely.
I love that. And I love that you have that on your wrist.
Yes, joy. Absolutely. Even on the days that are hard, right? And there are some hard days, but yeah. But we're in it, like I know, like we'll talk about the marigold piece. Like we're really just we're in it together, even when we don't get to see each other every day and talk to each other every day. I see what's happening, and I see on social media people pushing back, and even some of the lessons that people are teaching their students in their classrooms and things are just so really talking about like what it is that we share as a human family and how do we take care of each other. Yeah, that's very motivational.
That's beautiful. Just another thank you to everyone for joining, and especially to Afrika Afeni Mills for putting this important work out there and speaking to us tonight about it. So thank you all.
Thank you, and congratulations. Thank you. I'm so excited that you're all here. And hey, Felicia. Everybody have a good night and happy holidays, happy rest, happy vacation, happy whatever it is that you're going to be experiencing over the next few weeks.